The HOA thought they had finally cornered me. One sunny morning, a crisp white envelope slid under my door with a notice that made my blood boil. You are hereby fined $150,000 for owning excessive water rights. Excessive water rights. I stared at the paper, stunned. The small lake behind my property, which had belonged to my family for generations, was suddenly a crime because it disrupted the neighborhood's visual harmony. But the real insult wasn't the fine, it was the smug smile of Karen, the HOA president, when she strutted across my driveway that evening. She said I could negotiate if I drained part of my lake and attended her exclusive garden party to discuss terms. What she didn't know was that I owned more than the lake. I owned the dam that fed it, and if she wanted to play with water, I was about to drown her arrogance. The morning began like any other in our quiet lakeside neighborhood. Mist hovered over the surface of my family's lake, a silver veil that softened the edges of the pine trees and made everything look like a painting. I stood on my back deck with a mug of coffee in hand, breathing in the cool air and listening to the distant calls of ducks gliding across the water. This lake had been my sanctuary since I was a child. My grandfather built the dam that fed it, and he left it to my father, who left it to me. It wasn't just water to me, it was history. Every ripple carried the sound of my family's laughter from long summers spent fishing, swimming, and telling stories around a crackling fire. I thought that morning would be as peaceful as all the others. I had no idea it would mark the beginning of a storm that would drown my neighborhood in chaos. It started with a simple soft thunk against my front door. I set down my coffee and went to investigate. On the doormat lay a crisp, white envelope, perfectly centered like a carefully aimed dart. There was no knock, no doorbell, just silence. The return address was stamped with the three letters I had grown to despise. HOA. My stomach tightened as I picked it up. Our homeowners association had always been a thorn in my side, but lately, it felt more like a poison. With a slow rip, I opened the envelope and slid out a single sheet of paper. The words made my heart pound against my ribs. You are hereby fined $150,000 for owning excessive water rights. I blinked hard, thinking I must have misread it. Owning too much water. I read it again, each line sharpening like a knife. According to some newly passed neighborhood bylaw, my lake was considered a shared visual resource and my excessive control over its water levels posed a risk to neighborhood harmony. Therefore, the HOA was imposing a staggering fine for what they called unbalanced stewardship. My first reaction was disbelief, then laughter. It had to be a prank, but the official seal of the HOA at the bottom was no joke. This was real. I immediately thought of one person, Karen Peterson. The HOA president had been a constant irritation since the day I moved back to take care of the property after my father passed. She was the kind of person who smiled with her mouth but not her eyes. The kind of neighbor who inspected your trash bins for recycling violations and measured your lawn height with a ruler. In the 2 years I'd been back, she had filed complaints about everything from the rustic appearance of my dock to the unapproved bird population created by the ducks who nested near the dam. She once left a note on my door demanding I relocate the frogs because their croaking disturbed her evening wine time. But this finds this outrageous. Absurd fine was her boldest move yet. I spent the next hour pacing the kitchen, rereading the letter until the words blurred. My coffee sat forgotten and cold on the counter. I dialed the HOA office number listed at the bottom, but it went straight to voicemail. Of course they wanted their threats to sit and fester. I left a firm but measured message demanding an explanation, then called my friend Mark, who worked as a real estate attorney in town. This can't be legal, I said, barely able to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation. HOAs are tricky, Mark replied after a long sigh. If they passed a bylaw and had it recorded with the county, they can technically fine you. But a fine of $150? That's outrageous. Did you agree to anything recently? Any meetings you missed? That question stung. I had missed the last few HOA meetings, mainly because sitting through Karen's endless monologues about community aesthetics felt like a slow death. My absence, it seemed, had given her room to sneak something through. By midday, my voicemail pinged with a message from Karen herself. Her voice oozed false sympathy as she explained that the fine was unfortunate, but necessary to maintain balance in the neighborhood. She invited me to discuss the matter amicably at her upcoming garden party this Saturday. The nerve of this woman! She wanted to ruin me and then sip champagne in her backyard while pretending it was just business. I replayed the message twice, each time hearing more arrogance in her tone. Excessive water rights, she said, as though the lake my grandfather built was some kind of toy I was hogging. I felt my hands clench into fists. She wasn't just fining me, she was trying to take control of the lake itself. That evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the water into molten gold, I sat on the edge of my dock and tried to think. My dog Buddy rested his head on my knee, sensing my agitation. Across the lake, Karen's house glowed with warm light, her perfectly manicured garden visible even from here. I could almost picture her smug smile as she drafted that letter, imagining how cornered I would feel. But she underestimated me. This wasn't just a piece of land to me, it was a legacy, and I wasn't about to let anyone, especially Karen, bully me into surrendering it. The next morning, I drove to the county clerk's office with a folder of old documents my father had kept in a safe. They were the original dam deeds and water rights agreements, some dating back over 60 years. The clerk, a kindly older man named Harvey, helped me dig through the archives to confirm what I already suspected. My family didn't just own the lake, we controlled the inflow and outflow of water through the dam. The HOA had jurisdiction over landscaping, fences, and paint colors, but the dam was untouchable. Its operation was regulated by county law, not neighborhood bylaws. Harvey tapped one of the yellowed papers with a grin. "Your grandfather was a smart man," he said. "These rights are ironclad. No HOA can tell you how to run this dam." Relief flooded through me, but it was quickly followed by a sharper, colder feeling. Strategy. Karen thought she had me trapped, but in reality, I held the power. Not just legal power, the physical power to control every drop of water in that lake. And if Karen wanted to weaponize the rules, I had an even stronger weapon, the dam itself. Driving home, I replayed her voicemail in my mind. "Come to the garden party, and we can discuss terms." The words dripped with condescension, but beneath them, I heard something else. Pride. Karen loved to show off her home, her roses, her ability to command the neighborhood's attention. This party wasn't just a social event, it was her stage, and stages can be ruined. When I pulled into my driveway, the lake shimmered in the late afternoon sun. I walked down to the dam, listening to the steady roar of water cascading through the spillway. My grandfather used to say, "Water is patient but powerful. Give it time, and it will carve through mountains." I rested my hand on the cold metal of the floodgate wheel, feeling the vibration of the current beneath. Patience, power. Karen had no idea what kind of forces she was toying with. Over the next few days, I noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood. Neighbors avoided my eyes when I passed, their smiles tight and uneasy. A few offered whispered apologies, admitting they'd been pressured into supporting the new buy. Karen said it was just a small adjustment. One elderly woman told me, wringing her hands, "We didn't know it would lead to this." Their fear of Karen was almost tangible. She ruled through intimidation and charm, wrapping her threats in flowery language and polite smiles. By Friday night, the forecast predicted heavy rain for Saturday afternoon, the exact time of Karen's garden party. I stood on my porch, watching dark clouds gather on the horizon, and felt a strange calm settle over me. Nature was already preparing to remind Karen of something she had forgotten. Water belongs to no one but itself. And I, the man she thought she could find into submission, happened to control the key that held it back. That as I turned away from the lake, I imagined Karen arranging her delicate centerpieces, checking the weather app on her phone, reassuring herself that the rain would hold off. I almost smiled. She believed she had all the power. But power isn't about fines or bylaws. It's about knowing when to act and when to let nature take its course. And tomorrow, as the rain fell and the dam gates stood ready, I would show Karen exactly who owned the water she tried so hard to control. Saturday morning arrived heavy with the promise of rain. The sky was a deep slate gray, the kind of color that seemed to press down on the trees and make every sound sharper. I woke earlier than usual, partly because of the restless night and partly because my mind was buzzing with everything that had unfolded during the week. The letter from the HOA still lay on my kitchen counter, its edges curling slightly from being read too many times. Every time I passed it, the bold black letters "excessive water rights" mocked me like a bad joke. But this morning, I felt a strange sense of control. I had spent the last few days digging through county records, confirming my family's rights to the dam and the water that fed my lake. Karen thought she'd cornered me, but she had no idea that her carefully laid trap was already cracking at the edges. As I brewed a pot of coffee, Buddy trotted into the kitchen, his nails clicking on the wooden floor. His wagging tail was a small comfort against the storm building outside and inside me. "Today's the day, boy," I said, scratching behind his ears. He tilted his head, as if he understood. Maybe he did. Animals have a way of sensing tension before humans do. I stepped outside onto the porch with my coffee and inhaled the sharp scent of wet earth. The air was thick, damp, and charged with the kind of electricity that only comes before a storm. Across the lake, Karen's house stood like a gleaming monument to control. Even from this distance, I could see the white tents being set up in her backyard for the garden party. Workers scurried about, staking poles into the soft ground, their bright rain jackets flashing like signal lights. A garden party during a rainstorm was a bold move, but it was exactly like Karen to pretend she could command even the weather. My phone buzzed on the porch railing. A text from an unknown number flashed on the screen. "Looking forward to seeing you today. We can still resolve this peacefully." I didn't need to guess who it was from. The deliberate phrasing, the veiled threat wrapped in politeness, was pure Karen. I didn't respond. Instead, I walked down the gravel path to the dam. The sound of rushing water grew louder with each step, blending with the distant hum of workers across the lake. The dam stood solid and unmoving, a piece of history built by my grandfather's hands. I rested my palm on the cold metal of the floodgate wheel and felt the vibration of the current below. The storm wasn't here yet, but the river upstream was already swelling with the week's rainfall. The lake level had risen by a few inches overnight. just enough to make the water lap hungrily against the rocks. Never let a bully decide the rules of your own land. My grandfather's voice echoed in my mind. He used to tell me that water was both patient and unstoppable, and that the person who controls its path holds a quiet kind of power. Karen might have bylaws and fines, but I had something stronger: nature itself. By mid-morning, the neighborhood was alive with subtle activity. Cars rolled slowly down the streets, their tires hissing on wet pavement as guests in pastel outfits and polished shoes arrived for Karen's party. Even with the rain threatening, she had managed to lure a crowd. I spotted a few familiar faces. Neighbors who once waved warmly now avoided my eyes, their smiles strained and guilty. Some slowed their cars when they passed my driveway, curiosity flickering in their glances, but none dared to stop. Karen's shadow stretched long over this community, and even the brave preferred to stay in her good graces. Around 11, Mark called. His voice was calm but firm. I've reviewed the documents you sent me. You're in the clear. The HOA can fine you until they're blue in the face, but they can't touch that dam or the water it controls. They're bluffing, hoping you'll cave before it goes to court. I figured as much, I said, watching another car disappear around the bend toward Karen's house. Be careful though, Mark added. People like Karen don't like to lose. She pushed harder when she realizes she can't win on paper. I thanked him and hung up, his words lingering in my mind. He was right. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. This garden party wasn't just a social event, it was a show of strength, an invitation for me to kneel publicly while she basked in the admiration of her followers. By early afternoon, the storm clouds deepened, turning the sky a bruised purple. The first low rumbles of thunder rolled across the hills, making the lake tremble with tiny ripples. I watched from my porch as Karen's guests clutched their umbrellas and darted between tents, their laughter brittle against the wind. Despite the darkening sky, the party pressed on. Music floated faintly across the water, a cheerful tune that felt almost defiant. At 2 o'clock sharp, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a call. Karen's name flashed across the screen. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity got the better of me. Good afternoon, she said, her voice syrupy sweet. I noticed you haven't RSVP'd. I do hope you'll be joining us. This is a perfect opportunity to discuss the situation. Perhaps we can find a solution that benefits everyone. Such as, I asked flatly. Well, she continued, pausing just long enough to sound calculating. The board might be willing to reconsider the fine if you agree to lower your lake level permanently. It's really about balance, you understand. We must maintain harmony in our shared environment. I stared at the lake, the water glinting under the heavy clouds. Harmony, I repeated. Funny word for extortion. Karen chuckled lightly, but there was no humor in it. Oh, come now, let's not be dramatic. This is about fairness. Too much water on one property creates an imbalance. An imbalance leads to resentment. Surely you don't want to be the cause of neighborhood unrest. My grip tightened on the phone. The dam belongs to my family. The water rights are ours. Your bylaws don't change that. Her voice cooled, the sweetness fading like a mask slipping off. Be careful, Mr. Lakewood. Rules can change. Fines can increase. Friends can become unfriendly. With that, she ended the call. I stared at the silent phone, my heart pounding. Her threat was clear, but beneath it, I heard something else, a hint of desperation. She knew she was losing control. The first fat raindrops began to fall just as the party hit full swing. From my porch, I could see Karen making her rounds under the tents, her floral dress fluttering in the wind as she greeted each guest with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Servers darted between tables with trays of champagne, their movements quickened by the growing rain. The music played on, but it sounded thinner now, strained against the drum of water on canvas. I grabbed my raincoat and walked down to the dam. The gravel path was slick under my boots, and the air smelled of ozone and wet pine. The river upstream had grown louder, a deep, steady roar that vibrated through the earth. The lake was swelling, the waterline creeping higher along the rocks. I rested my hand on the floodgate wheel and felt the shiver of power beneath my palm. One turn, and the water would surge downstream, harmless enough to be natural but strong enough to flood low-lying areas like Karen's meticulously planned garden. I wasn't planning anything illegal. The dam was designed to release water when levels rose, and with the storm, it was well within my rights to prevent overflow. But there was a difference between routine maintenance and timing. And timing, I knew, was everything. As the rain intensified, the lake darkened to a deep, restless green. I could see Karen's guests huddling closer under the tents, their laughter now punctuated by nervous glances toward the churning water. Even from this distance, I imagined Karen reassuring them, insisting everything was under control. She always believed she could outtalk reality. I stayed by the dam as the storm gathered strength, my coat soaked and my heart steady. I wasn't here to cause chaos for its own sake. I was here to remind Karen and maybe the whole neighborhood that power doesn't come from titles or fines. It comes from knowing when to act and when to let nature speak for you. The rain poured harder, drumming against the metal wheel beneath my hand. I thought of my grandfather standing here decades ago, his calloused fingers turning the same mechanism, his eyes scanning the same stormy sky. He'd told me once that the dam was more than a structure. It was a promise that our family would protect the lake, not just for ourselves but for the land that needed it. And sometimes, protecting something meant letting the water run free. By the time I turned back toward the house, the decision had already formed in my mind, as natural as the rain falling around me. Karen had invited me to her party to negotiate. Instead, I would let the storm negotiate for me. Nature doesn't sign contracts. Nature doesn't bow to bylaw. And as I walked back through the pounding rain, I couldn't help but feel a quiet thrill. The water was rising. The dam was ready, and Karen's perfect little world was about to learn what balance truly meant. By mid-afternoon, the sky had turned into a swirling mass of dark clouds, heavy enough to make the air feel almost alive. Thunder rolled in the distance, deep and resonant, like a slow drumbeat announcing the inevitable. From my back porch, I could see the white tents of Karen's garden party glowing faintly in the gray gloom across the lake. The guests were still there, tiny figures darting from tent to tent, their pastel outfits like splashes of misplaced color against the darkening world. Despite the gathering storm, Karen's party was in full swing. I could hear faint strains of music drifting over the water, cheerful and brittle, like a smile forced through clenched teeth. The rain had been falling steadily for nearly an hour by now, not a gentle drizzle, but a determined downpour that slicked every surface and made the lake shimmer with restless energy. I stood at the window, watching the water level rise inch by inch against the rocks, and felt a strange calm settle over me. For days, my mind had been a storm of its own frustration, disbelief, but now everything inside me felt still. The decisions were made. Nature would do the rest. Buddy padded into the room and nudged my leg, his eyes questioning. I crouched to scratch his head, my hand damp from the condensation on the window. Almost time, boy, I said quietly. He wagged his tail but didn't leave my side. Even he could sense that something important was about to unfold. At 3 o'clock, a sudden flash of lightning split the sky, followed by a crack of thunder that made the windows tremble. The storm had fully arrived. Sheets of rain blurred the world outside, turning Karen's backyard into a watercolor painting of whites and grays. Through the shifting curtains of water, I could just make out the frantic movements of her guests as they clutched umbrellas and scrambled to secure decorations. Despite their efforts, the wind kept tearing at the tents, flapping the fabric like giant wings. My phone buzzed on the counter. A text message from an unknown number lit up the screen. I hope you're watching the weather. Perhaps now you'll understand the importance of balance. K. I stared at the message, my lips curling into a humorless smile. Even now, Karen couldn't resist one last jab. She thought this storm was her ally, a chance to remind me that nature itself was on her side. But she didn't know the truth. The storm wasn't her, a light was mine. I pulled on my raincoat and stepped outside. The moment I opened the door, the storm swallowed me whole. Rain lashed against my face like tiny needles, and the wind whipped through the trees with a low moaning howl. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, sharp and electric. Each step down the gravel path to the dam was slick and treacherous, the stones shifting beneath my boots. Buddy trotted close behind, his fur plastered to his body, but he didn't falter. When I reached the dam, the sound of rushing water roared like an angry beast. The river upstream had swollen to nearly double its usual size, sending torrents of muddy water crashing into the lake. The floodgate wheel glistened with rain, its metal surface slick under my fingers. I rested my hand on it and closed my eyes for a moment, listening to the deep vibration of the water beneath. It wasn't just noise, it was power. Pure, unstoppable power. The legal documents I had reviewed earlier in the week flashed through my mind. I wasn't breaking any laws. The dam was designed for controlled releases during heavy rains to prevent overflow. Opening the floodgate now would be not only legal but responsible. But timing, I knew, was everything. Too early, and the release would look routine. Too late, and the damage might cross the line from natural to deliberate. I needed it to look like nothing more than nature doing what nature does best. I tightened my grip on the wheel and began to turn. Slowly at first, feeling the resistance of the metal as the mechanism engaged. The roar of water intensified immediately, a deep guttural surge as the floodgate began to open. Spray shot up in a cold mist, soaking my face and blurring my vision. Downstream, the lake responded like a living thing, the water swirling faster as it rushed toward the outlet that fed the creek running behind. Karen's property? The effect was almost instant. From my vantage point, I could see the low-lying sections of Karen's garden beginning to glisten with pooling water. Her famous rose beds, usually standing tall and defiant, were already bending under the weight of the rain. The carefully manicured lawn transformed into a patchwork of puddles, the green grass disappearing beneath a rising sheen of muddy water dot across the lake. Chaos unfolded like a slow-motion play. Guests shouted over the wind, their laughter replaced by sharp cries of alarm as water crept toward the edge of the tents. I could see Karen in the center of it all, her floral dress plastered to her body, her perfectly styled hair collapsing in the downpour. Even from this distance, I could recognize her frantic gestures as she barked orders at the workers trying to secure the tents and divert the water. The sight was almost surreal. Karen, the woman who prided herself on control, was suddenly powerless. Her rules, her fines, Her carefully crafted image, all of it was meaningless against the force of the storm and the water now flowing exactly where I had allowed it to go. For a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. This wasn't just her property. People were their neighbors who hadn't asked to be caught in this battle. But then I remembered the letter, the arrogance in her voice when she called, the way she had tried to bend the entire neighborhood to her will. This wasn't cruelty. This was balance. Thunder cracked overhead, so loud it rattled the metal of the dam. I tightened the wheel another half turn, ensuring a steady but controlled release. The current surged in response, a deep rumble vibrating through the earth beneath my feet. Downstream, the creek behind Karen's property swelled, spilling over its banks and snaking into the garden like a restless serpent. I stayed there for nearly an hour, watching as nature did its work. The storm showed no signs of letting up. Sheets of rain blurred the world into shades of silver and gray, and the wind howled like a chorus of ghosts. Across the lake, Karen's once perfect garden party was reduced to a soggy disaster. Tables floated in shallow pools of muddy water. Chairs toppled like fallen soldiers. Guests waded through ankle-deep floods, their designer shoes ruined, their pastel clothes stained with mud. Through it all, Karen remained at the center, her arms flailing as she tried to direct the hopeless cleanup. At one point, she slipped in the mud and went down hard, splashing into the brown water with a scream that cut through the roar of the storm. A few guests rushed to help her, but the damage was already done. Her image of elegance and authority had dissolved into a wet, shivering mess. Eventually, I turned the floodgate back to its neutral position, letting the mechanism lock with a heavy clank. The release had done its job. The lake level was stable, and the water coursing downstream was well within legal limits. I wiped the rain from my eyes and looked one last time at the chaos across the lake. Karen was standing near a collapsed tent, her arms crossed tightly around herself, her face pale and tight with rage. Even through the storm, I could feel her eyes scanning the opposite shore, searching for me. I made my way back up the path, my boots squelching in the mud. Buddy trotted at my side, his tail wagging as if he sensed that something important had been accomplished. By the time I reached the house, the storm was beginning to lose some of its fury. The thunder rumbled more softly now, and the rain fell in steadier, calmer sheets. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, sharp and clean. Inside, I peeled off my soaked coat and stood for a long moment by the window, watching the lake churn under the fading storm. Despite the chaos, I felt no triumph. What I felt was deeper, more elemental. It wasn't victory, it was balance. Karen had pushed, and the water had pushed back. I had simply opened the door and let nature decide the outcome. As evening fell, the lights of Karen's house flickered on across the lake. From this distance, I could see figures moving inside, their silhouettes sharp against the warm glow. No music played now, no laughter carried across the water. The party was over, drowned by a force no bylaw could control. My phone buzzed on the counter again. This time, it was a voicemail. I hesitated before pressing play. Karen's voice came through, sharp and trembling. "This isn't over," she said, her words clipped and furious. "You think you're clever, but you've made a mistake. We'll see how long your damn holds." The message ended with a harsh click. I stared at the phone, a slow smile creeping across my face. She still didn't get it. This wasn't about cleverness. It wasn't about laws or fines or even revenge. It was about the simple truth my grandfather had known all along. You can't control water. You can only guide it. And when someone tries to own what can't be owned, the water always finds a way to remind them who's really in charge. As I turned off the lights and let the house settle into quiet darkness, I felt the steady, reassuring hum of the lake outside. The storm would pass, but its message would remain, carried in every ripple of the water. Karen had started a war she couldn't win. And tonight, as the rain eased and the moon broke through the clouds, the lake itself had delivered the first undeniable strike. The morning of the garden party dawned like it was trying to play a cruel joke on me. The sun burned through a thin veil of clouds, bright and smug, casting a golden glow over Willow Creek's perfectly manicured streets. From my porch, I could hear the soft hum of activity near the clubhouse, a distant symphony of laughter, clinking glassware, and the rhythmic thump of heavy footsteps as vendors and servers rushed to set up for the event of the year. Karen had invited practically everyone in the neighborhood, along with some local officials and a few news outlets. She somehow persuaded to cover her charity fundraiser. It was supposed to be her crowning achievement, the moment she cemented her status as queen of the HOA, and she was about to find out that nature, especially my water, has a way of humbling even the most entitled of tyrants. I stood at the edge of my property, staring at the dam that separated my private lake from the HOA's precious gardens and walking paths. The water shimmered under the morning light, calm and deceptively peaceful. Weeks of quiet preparation had led to this moment. I had cleaned out the dam's sluice gate, checked the release mechanisms, and made sure the pressure would build up just enough to send a roaring sheet of water downstream without putting anyone in actual danger. This wasn't about destruction. It was about a message. Karen wanted to treat my lake like her personal bank account, sending me fake fines and threatening me with lawsuits for owning too much water. Today, She would learn what it really meant to underestimate someone who values both property and principle. As the hours passed, I could hear the party taking shape. Music floated across the breeze, some kind of jazz ensemble, warming up near the gazebo. I caught faint whiffs of roasted meats, sugary pastries, and expensive champagne. Every sound felt like a taunt, like Karen was daring me to act. My phone buzzed with texts from a few sympathetic neighbors who had caught wind of what I was planning. "Is it really happening today?" one asked. "Please tell me you're not kidding," said another. I replied with nothing but a single water drop emoji. The anticipation crackled in my chest like static electricity. By mid-afternoon, cars began arriving in droves, lining the HOA's private lanes with shiny luxury sedans and polished SUVs. I could almost picture Karen at the entrance, greeting each guest with her fake warmth and rehearsed charm. She thrived on attention, and the spectacle of this party, complete with a professional photographer and a drone buzzing overhead, was the ultimate fuel for her ego. I imagined her boasting about how she had finally taught that lake owner a lesson by hitting me with outrageous fines. What she didn't know was that the lesson was about to be hers, and it would be written in rushing water. When the clock finally crept toward 4 o'clock, I slipped on my work gloves and walked down to the dam. My boots crunched against the gravel path, each step echoing in my ears like a drumbeat. The air near the water was cooler, damp with the scent of moss and mud. The sound of the party grew louder as I approached the control gate. A faint chorus of laughter and the clinking of champagne flutes. I paused, taking in the scene one last time, the quiet before the storm. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if I was taking things too far, but then I remembered the letters, the threats, the fines that totaled over $30,000 for nothing more than owning water. My hesitation vanished. I grabbed the wheel and began to turn it. The metal groaned, stiff from years of disuse, but slowly it yielded to my strength. A deep rumble followed, the sound of water shifting against its restraints. I tightened my grip, twisting harder until the first surge burst through the gate with a satisfying roar. The lake responded instantly, sending a foamy torrent cascading down the spillway. The water glistened in the fading sunlight, alive and unstoppable, rushing toward the gardens below like a silver stampede. From where I stood, I could see the first signs of chaos. Guests near the far edge of the party began to point and shout as the small stream running through the HOA's prized rose garden swelled into a churning river. Tables wobbled as the ground grew slick. A waiter carrying a tray of hors d'oeuvres slipped, sending shrimp cocktails flying into the air. The band faltered mid-song, the saxophonist's note warping into a squeal as he scrambled to save his instrument from the rising spray. It was happening faster than even I had imagined. And then there was Karen. Even from a distance, she was impossible to miss, her wide-brimmed hat bobbing as she marched toward the chaos like a general surveying a battlefield. Her face, usually stretched into a smug smile, twisted into something between fury and panic. She barked orders at the guests, waving her arms wildly as if sheer willpower could stop the flood. But the water didn't care about her authority, her fines, or her perfectly coordinated decorations. It surged forward with unrelenting force, soaking her expensive floral centerpieces and toppling the giant Welcome to Willow Creek's charity gala sign with a loud, satisfying crash. I stayed hidden behind a cluster of trees as the scene descended into beautiful bedlam. Guests screamed and scrambled for higher ground, their fancy shoes splashing through muddy puddles. Balloons popped in rapid succession, sounding like distant gunfire. Someone tried to save the dessert table, but a sudden gush sent an entire chocolate fountain tipping into the grass, with a splatter that drew gasps and laughter in equal measure. A small child squealed with delight, clapping his hands as if this were the best entertainment of the afternoon. Karen, drenched and furious, finally spotted the source of the deluge. Her eyes locked on the dam, and for a split second, our gazes met across the chaos. I couldn't hear her over the roar of the water, but I could read her lips as she screamed a single word. "You?" I gave her a slow, deliberate nod before turning the wheel another fraction, releasing an even stronger rush that sent a fresh wave cascading into the heart of her precious party. The sound was magnificent, a deep, thunderous applause from nature itself. Guests began to flee toward their cars, but many found the narrow exit paths already slick and flooded. The valet team, bless their hearts, tried to maintain order, but the flood turned the neatly lined parking area into a slippery mess of honking horns and spinning tires. I could see people lifting their designer shoes above the water, their faces a mix of horror and disbelief. Karen's big moment had transformed into a live-action disaster film, and she was the unwilling star. As the water reached its peak and began to level out, I slowly closed the gate, letting the pressure ease before it could cause real damage. The goal had never been to hurt anyone, only to give the HOA and Karen, in particular, a taste of the power they thought they controlled. The dam was secure, the lake stable, and aside from some ruined decorations and a very muddy lawn, the neighborhood would recover just fine. But Karen's reputation, that would take far longer to repair. I stepped back from the controls and wiped my hands on my jeans, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and relief. For the first time in months, I wasn't the one on the defensive. I wasn't the one receiving threatening letters or counting every dollar in fines. Today, I had reclaimed my dignity, and I had done it without breaking a single law. The water was mine, after all. The HOA's own documents confirmed it. All I had done was open a gate on my property, a simple act that nature took care of from there. As I made my way back to the house, the sounds of the party faded into a muddled chorus of shouts and splashes. A few neighbors who had suspected what was coming caught my eye from their porches, offering subtle nods of approval. One older man raised his coffee cup in a silent toast. Another gave me a discreet thumbs up before ducking inside. Word would spread fast, and by nightfall, everyone in Willow Creek would know that the man they tried to fine for owning too much water had turned the tables in spectacular fashion. When I reached my porch, I sat down with a cold drink and watched the sun dip below the horizon, the sky streaked with pink and gold. The lake behind me was calm again, its surface smooth and reflective, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. But I knew better, and so did Karen. For all her threats and schemes, she had been outplayed by something as simple and unstoppable as flowing water, and this was only the beginning. The night after the flood was unnervingly quiet. Willow Creek, normally alive with the gentle murmur of sprinklers and distant chatter, felt like it had collectively held its breath. From my porch, the faint scent of wet soil lingered in the air, a reminder of the chaos that had unfolded only hours before. The lake.com and silver under the moonlight reflected a peacefulness that stood in stark contrast to the storm of emotion still rippling through the neighborhood. I sipped a cup of black coffee, half expecting flashing blue lights to appear at the end of my driveway, but none came. Instead, the only movement was the soft ripple of water against the dam and the occasional flicker of porch lights as curious neighbors peeked out to gauge the aftermath of what everyone was already calling the Great Garden washout. By early morning, the HOAS group chat was exploding. Screenshots of muddy guests, overturned tables, and soaked decorations flew from phone to phone. Karen's carefully curated image of control had been drowned literally in a tidal wave of her own arrogance. People were already posting videos of the event online, some showing her screeching at guests as they scrambled for safety. A particularly popular clip captured her stomping through ankle-deep water, her expensive hat plastered to her head, mascara streaking down her cheeks as she pointed furiously toward my dam. The internet, as it always does, had turned the disaster into a spectacle. Hashtags like hashtag Willow Creek Wave and hashtag Karen Flood trended locally within hours. I knew it was only a matter of time before Karen tried to spin the narrative. Sure enough, a formal email landed in my inbox shortly after sunrise. It was written in her signature sharp tone, accusing me of reckless endangerment, property sabotage, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. She demanded an immediate emergency meeting to address the unlawful actions of the lake owner. I almost laughed out loud. The irony was delicious. This was the same woman who fined me for owning water, now crying foul because the water she tried to control had ruined her party. I decided to attend the emergency meeting, not because I owed them anything, but because I wanted to watch Karen squirm. The clubhouse parking lot was a muddy mess when I arrived, with landscapers already working to repair the soggy lawn. Inside, the atmosphere was electric with barely contained gossip. Neighbors whispered behind their hands, their eyes darting between me and the HOA board members like they were watching a live courtroom drama. Karen sat at the head of the long oak table, her usual poise cracking at the edges. Her outfit was impeccable as always, but the dark circles under her eyes told the real story. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began, her voice tight but firm. "We are here to address a deliberate act of vandalism that endangered our community." She turned sharply to me, her eyes narrowing like a hawk spotting prey. "Mr. Thompson has?" I raised a hand before she could finish. "With all due respect, Karen, let's get the facts straight. The dam and the lake are entirely on my property. I released water in a controlled manner, well within the legal rights outlined in my deed. And, might I remind everyone, it was the HOA that tried to fine me for simply owning this water. If anything, yesterday was a natural consequence of your relentless harassment." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Several neighbors nodded, their expressions betraying a quiet satisfaction. Karen's lips thinned to a razor's edge. "You endangered lives," she hissed. "No one was hurt," I countered calmly, "and I have the measurements to prove the water flow never exceeded safe levels. But you know what is dangerous? Sending threatening letters, imposing illegal fines, and weaponizing an HOA against private property owners. Maybe we should talk about that instead." The room erupted in overlapping voices. Some sided with Karen, but many more questioned the legitimacy of her fines and her heavy-handed tactics. An older man named Richard, who had lived in Willow Creek for decades, stood up and cleared his throat. "I've had enough of this nonsense," he said. "The HOA is supposed to serve the community, not bully its residents. I move to suspend all fines against Mr. Thompson and launch an independent review of the board's actions." The vote that followed was swift and brutal. One by one, hands shot into the air. Even some of Karen's longtime allies hesitated before reluctantly siding with the majority. When the final count was read, the decision was clear. All fines against me were rescinded, and a committee would investigate Karen's leadership. The look on her face as the gavel struck was a portrait I would cherish forever: age, disbelief, and the dawning realization that her empire was crumbling. After the meeting, neighbors approached me with quiet congratulations. Some offered handshakes, others pats on the back. A few even apologized for not standing up sooner. I accepted their words graciously, but kept my focus on the bigger picture. This wasn't just about winning an argument. It was about setting a precedent. People like Karen thrive on intimidation. The only way to stop them is to remind them that power is borrowed, not owned. Over the next few weeks, the fallout continued. The HOA's investigation revealed a laundry list of questionable practices under Karen's leadership: misused funds, unauthorized fines, and a pattern of targeting homeowners who didn't fall in line with her vision of a perfect neighborhood. Facing mounting pressure, Karen resigned before the board could vote to remove her. The official statement claimed she was pursuing new opportunities, but everyone knew she had been forced out. Her once loyal circle of admirers evaporated overnight, leaving her isolated in the very community she once ruled. As for me, life returned to a peaceful rhythm. Without Karen's constant harassment, the lake became what it was always meant to be: a sanctuary. Ducks returned to the water's edge. Neighbors strolled along the shoreline without fear of fines, and I even hosted a small gathering to thank those who had supported me. We laughed about the infamous garden party, trading stories about the look on Karen's face as the water rushed in. It became a neighborhood legend, a cautionary tale whispered over backyard fences and late-night drinks. But the victory wasn't just personal. Something deeper had shifted in Willow Creek. The residents, once cowed by Karen's relentless authority, discovered their own voice. Meetings became more transparent, rules more reasonable. Instead of obsessing over petty fines and appearances, the HOA began focusing on real community improvements: repairs, safety measures, and events that actually brought people together. In an ironic twist, the flood that was meant to punish me had washed away the toxic control that had poisoned the neighborhood for years. One crisp autumn evening, as I stood by the dam watching the water flow gently beneath a sky streaked with orange and pink, I reflected on how far things had come. The lake shimmered like polished glass, peaceful and untamed. I thought of Karen, now a ghost in the place she once ruled, and wondered if she ever looked back on that day with anything other than bitterness. Probably not, but it didn't matter. Nature had done what it always does. It reminded everyone that no matter how tightly you try to control it, water finds its own way. I turned the wheel of the sluice gate ever so slightly, letting a small stream trickle through. The sound was soothing, a quiet echo of the power that had changed everything. This time, it wasn't about making a statement. It was about balance, about letting the lake breathe. As the water flowed, I felt a calm satisfaction settle over me. I hadn't just defended my property. I had defended the principle that no bully, no matter how powerful, can stand against persistence and a little bit of well-timed pressure. The HOA may have tried to fine me for owning too much water, but in the end, the water had the final word, and it spoke with a roar that no one in Willow Creek would ever forget. If you enjoyed this shocking real-life story, like, share, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to Bright Reality for more powerful stories that prove the truth is stranger than fiction.